When I first started reading chapter 5 of the book that inspired this summer series, Leadership Not by the Book, I got a little worried. I'm not going to lie. We've moved out of God centered practices and into people centered practices. And so naturally, the first chapter was all about legacy, and not just legacy, but building a business for the next 150 years. And my immediate thought was, does this even apply to me at all? Is this going to relate? Because, well, the reality is I don't have kids to leave a business to, and I'm a solo business owner, and I kind of always plan on being that. So am I even building a business that I intend to outlive me? But as he often does while I was reading, God reframed this concept for me. He showed me that legacy didn't mean what I thought it did. It's not about whether or not your business survives you. It's about the impact you leave on each individual you meet throughout the course of your business. And that reframe changed everything because suddenly this chapter is no longer about Fortune 500 companies and long-standing generational businesses. This is a chapter for me and for you. So if you initially thought like I did when you saw the title of this video, oh, this one's not for me, hang with me for just a few minutes because I think you're going to be surprised like I was. But before we dive into this, make sure you like this video, subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, and ring that notification bell so that you never miss a tutorial or upload. All right, let's get into this. Okay, so like I hinted at the beginning, this chapter is part of a larger series. This is a 12-part series that I'm doing, and it was inspired originally by this book, Leadership Not by the Book. It's by David Green, the CEO of Hobby Lobby. And yes, we are following the chapters throughout. I highly recommend that you watch this whole series in order because there is clearly an order to what we're talking about here. But as I always try to do, we're going to actually start in the scripture first because, yes, this book is an inspiration, but it's not our inspiration, right? So we're talking about this concept of legacy, I guess, and the impact that we leave through our business and through just our lives in general on other people. And so I thought, who better to go to than the Bible, the people who are the first legacies of our faith? I mean, you've got so many good ones in there. You've got Moses and Abraham and David and Jonathan and Paul, of course, who we're going to touch on here, and the disciples. I mean, all of them left legacies for us. And yes, they did it through generational storytelling and, obviously the stories that they put in the Bible, but it's more than that, right? It's obviously grown well beyond that. And I just got so much more inspired reading this chapter, realizing that this concept of legacy that I kind of felt wasn't for me because I don't have a next generation to leave a business to or, build wealth for, or whatever we think of as legacy in this day and age. It doesn't mean that I don't have a legacy to leave. I mean, in reality, some of these videos could lead to a legacy, and I'm learning just the interpersonal relationships that I'm having with clients on a day-to-day basis. That is leaving a legacy. And I think part of what has always made legacy feel so overwhelming to me, so massive, is just this thought that everything that we do is meant to be so deep and so impactful and just that it has to be so huge. And the more I'm realizing that it's actually closer to what it looks like when we're trying to build new habits and new routines in our lives. It's really about those little tiny things that we do that over time just build on each other and turn into a legacy. So the passage that I'm going to be reading is from 1 Corinthians 3, and it's verses 5 through 9. And as usual, I'll be reading in the NLT version. This is Paul talking, and he's talking, referencing himself and Apollos, who is another person who used to travel with him and teach Jesus' teachings to the new church. So what he says is, after all, who is Apollos? Who is Paul? We are only God's servants through whom you believed the good news. Each of us did the work the Lord gave us. I planted the seed in your hearts, and Apollos watered it, but it was God who made it grow. It's not important who does the planting or who does the watering. What's important is that God makes the seed grow. The one who plants and the one who waters work together with the same purpose, and both will be rewarded for their own hard work. For we are both God's workers, and you are God's field. You are God's building. Now, I love this because it reminds me that, like, it's not all on me. And I know we hear that a lot, right? Like, oh, you planted a seed. It's not your responsibility to see it all the way through to harvest or fruition, whatever symbolism you want to use there. But it's good to have those reminders sometimes, because I think, especially as we are, getting really intentional about trying to build a business that has a lasting impact in this way, like we were talking about last week with the things that we do that are meant to impact other people's souls, those are the things that matter. Well, yes, they are, but if we tell ourselves that we are the only ones responsible for that, that's a lot of pressure. And I think for me, that's absolutely going to hold me back. It's going to stop me from saying something, because I feel like as soon as I start down that road, now I have all this responsibility. And I think this is such a great reminder that actually the responsibility is not ours. It was never meant to be. It's always been God's. We're just supposed to do our part along the way. So we may be planting the seed. We may be the first person saying the thing, or we may be the one coming along and watering a seed that someone else planted. But ultimately, it's God who is doing the real work there to cultivate that faith and, help it come to fruition. It's not up to us. And so this is such a great reminder, because we see someone like Paul, who most of us look to as this like ideal missionary. We know he wasn't perfect, obviously, but we have a tendency to put him up on a pedestal because he wrote so much of the New Testament, and, there's so much wisdom there. And so obviously he must have been pulling people out of the gutter and straight into their strongest faith. And I mean, clearly that's not true. He had his small part just like we do. And so I think it's really helpful for me, at least, to see that someone that I think of as just so amazing just did the same things that I'm doing in his own way. I've told you guys before that the Bible that I have has these little stories sometimes that are inserted in. Sometimes they're written in more of a way like we talked about one a while ago. It was written from the perspective of Mary, as in Mary and Martha. And so it was kind of more fiction based. But sometimes they're just insights and things that other women and, sometimes biblical scholars are thinking about certain passages and stuff like that. There was one here that was specifically on this passage that we just read that I found really impactful. And I think partly because of the first sentence. Like, as soon as I saw this first sentence, it really spoke to me, because like I said earlier, I've always felt like, how am I meant to leave a legacy when I don't have kids? Because when we talk about legacy in this day and age, that's usually what we're talking about, right? Our kids, our grandkids, things like that. And so I often focus on that thing that doesn't exist in my life that means that I can't do something. I can't leave that legacy. So the first sentence of this really got to me. I won't read the whole thing, or if I do, I'll try to read it fast. So she starts with, it's easy to ruminate on what is lacking in our lives, but Paul gives us a better alternative. Instead of focusing on what we're missing, let's focus on our mission. And then it goes on to talk about two questions that come out through this passage. First, whose story do you want to be part of? Your mission is contingent on whose story you make central in your life. So again, obviously we're talking about the story of Jesus. If that is the focus of our mission, then what we have or don't have is irrelevant, right? Because we all have that same story. And then the second question is, who are the people you want to impact your story? Which I found interesting because, we think about who are the people we want to impact with our story. But this is saying kind of the opposite. Who are the people that we want to have impact our story? Meaning, and we've heard this before, I've heard this before, I don't know if I've ever said it here, but like this idea of the 5 people that you most spend time with are going to have the biggest impact on your life. And, you're going to have a tendency to become more and more like those people, which is true. Absolutely. I mean, you can see that objectively in life. So it really got me thinking about, not just whose story am I focusing on? Obviously, we talked about that, but who am I surrounding myself with? Who am I partnering with to leave my legacy, to make the impact that I am trying to make? And I just found that really thought provoking. I don't have an answer. I'm not really going anywhere specific with that, but I just found it really thought provoking. So I wanted to share that. But to get back to the inspiration for all of this, the chapter in the book, what he's most talking about is based on this article from the Harvard Business Review. And it's all about, it was like a study that they did on the commonalities of businesses that last 100 years or more. And I'm not going into all the details here. If you want to read that, read the chapter or go find the article and read the article. But there were a few things that stood out to me in that chapter, and one in particular that I want to talk about with you. And it comes from this concept, and this is straight from the book. It says, they were more concerned about the organization they'll leave behind than how it looks while they're there. And I found that interesting because I don't really know what's in the mind of most corporate executives. They don't really share, I think, the reality of what they're thinking and worrying about with, their employees and things like that. But what they talk about a lot is company culture, and, they make it about employees a lot. Obviously, it's about customers too. We know that, but they tend to talk a lot about, employee life, employee culture. And don't get me wrong. I think that's important. Obviously, I am an employee, so I appreciate that the company that I work for does care about that. But I really appreciated that in this book, that's not where David really went at all. And it's not what really came out of this study either. And usually when you read business books, you read books on leadership and stuff like that, it is such a central focus. And so it was refreshing to me that it wasn't the focus here, not because it's not important, but because there are other things that matter. And so it was nice to get a fresh perspective. I've done some personality and, working assessments and things like that to see what kind of person I am, what kind of worker I am. And one of the things that comes back for me a lot is that I'm kind of a big picture, kind of forward thinking person. And I think that's part of why I love what I do so much because, it basically means I'm like the vision person. I also have to execute because that's just the reality of being a solo owned business, is that you don't get to just do the part that you love and then hand off the parts that you don't love as much to other people. But being that big picture person and being able to look at something from a higher perspective and like see more, see what's possible in the future, that forward thinking view, but also look back and see what worked, what didn't work, and just kind of bringing all of that together into one larger picture. That does feel a lot like who I am and how I think. And so I think that this really spoke to me because that's the kind of leader that I want to be. I don't want to be a leader that is so focused on the minutia. Again, not because it doesn't matter. The here and now matters, but just like we were talking about last week, the only things that really matter are those things that last for eternity. Talk about taking the long view, right? But I mean, that's the kind of leader I want to be. So I really appreciated that that was the focus here, more so than like, here's how you manage employees when you have like, 50,000 employees and you want your company to last. That's not a perspective that is helpful for me right now. So this was really cool. And when I approach this idea of legacy from this new perspective, I realized that it's not really about whether or not my business survives me. I mean, it's irrelevant. The business that I have right now is not likely to outlive me because it requires me to be present. But the beauty is that it's not about that at all. It's about the impact that I'm having with those people. And that absolutely can and will outlive me. And I realize this is such a small piece of what David was talking about in this chapter, but it's what God was really showing me through this topic. And I think I really needed to hear it right now. So, it brought up the question for me, how can I live this out as I'm growing my business? And as I was thinking on all of this while I was prepping this episode, I was, sitting downstairs in that special corner that I've created for myself where I read the Bible and write and pray. And I was doing that and listening to the worship songs that I'm leading on Sunday. And it struck me that I don't specifically need to answer that question. It's not about the specifics. they're not the point. The important thing is that I recognize and that you recognize who we're partnered with in this mission. And the beauty of that is that we don't have to have all the answers because he does. All I need to do and all you need to do is continue to be intentional about setting aside the time to spend with God, to know his heart, to know his word, and to remain open to the opportunities that he is presenting to us on a daily basis to make that impact and start building that legacy. And then, of course, to have the courage to obey. Thanks for watching this episode all the way to the end, and I hope that you liked it, and more importantly, that you found it helpful. If you did, make sure to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share this video with another Christian business owner that you know is going to love it as much as you did. God bless you.